On the line with us is the author of the new book, Everything Trump Touches Dies. The subtitle, A Republican Strategist Gets Real About the Worst President Ever. It's by Rick Wilson. Rick Wilson is a Republican strategist, and his Twitter feed is the Rick Wilson. And Rick, do you have a website? I don't see it here.
It's therickwilson.com.
Say it again?
therickwilson.com.
therickwilson.com. Cool. Rick, you're a Republican strategist and have been involved in Republican campaigns for years and years. You know the Republican Party. Donald Trump tweeted yesterday that it's just a normal thing to reach out to a foreign government and ask them for help to take down your adversary in a political campaign. Is that true?
You know, Tom, I've been involved in Republican politics for 30 years. And there are a few things I've never done, and one of them is to reach out to hostile foreign powers representatives to ask them for dirt on an opponent. Because I don't think I can think of anyone, Republican or Democrat, in my history in politics, as I said, for almost 30 years now, who would do that. It's unthinkable. So, of course, that's what the Trump people did. Because it was unthinkable, they decided to go ahead and do it.
So here's the weird coincidence, Rick. On this day in 1974, or yesterday, August 5th, on August 5th, 1974, Richard Nixon, under orders from the Supreme Court, released the White House tapes, which led to the end of his presidency a few months later. On that same day, yesterday, Donald Trump released the apparently truth about this meeting that his son and Jared Kushner and others had with these Russian lawyers and Russian representatives of Russian oligarchs in Trump Tower. Do you think that this is the end of the Trump presidency? I've heard from two sources now that the White House right now is in lockdown, that Trump's travel plans have been canceled, essentially, that Sarah Huckabee Sanders is not going to be holding a press conference today. I mean, all this may change. It's a very fluid situation. But apparently there's like major freakout going on in the White House.
Well, Tom, if you were in the White House, I think you'd be freaked out, too.
Yeah.
I mean, he has exposed his own son to legal jeopardy. That tweet will go down in history as one of these tweets heard around the world because it had so many levels of bad in it and so many downside consequences to it that I think we're going to look back and say that was a real inflection point where he opened himself up and opened his son up to even greater legal pressure. A lot of this was stuff that Robert Mueller already knew. But thanks for the confirmation, Don. You know, this is a guy who truly doesn't understand the scope of the peril he is in. And so we're ending up in a situation, in my view, that while this may not be the end, this certainly opened up a gigantic chest wound in the Trump administration. And the legal vulnerability they had all along has now been enhanced. So, it's one of the things I talk about in the book. This is a guy who thinks he is such a genius about negotiation and about the world. And he's lived in this bubble all along of New York, sort of tabloid BS.
Right.
And now that he's hitting the wall of reality, and that part of that wall is named Robert Mueller, he's having a really bad time.
Yeah, it seems. It will take 17 Republicans in the United States Senate to remove Donald Trump from office. That was not a big lift during the Nixon administration when the Republicans, who were big supporters of Richard Nixon just 6 months earlier, realized how corrupt Nixon was and how crazy he was in some ways. Do you think that this tweet is enough to have pushed him over the top with some number of Republicans in the Senate and possibly 17, or is it going to take a lot more than this?
I think it's actually going to still take more than this, Tom, because this is a party that is basically lives in terror of Donald Trump. He is in many ways a political terrorist for Republican elected officials. They live in mortal fear that he is going to tweet about them or talk about them in a bad way, because the moment that happens, then come the death threats and the craziness and the Fox News coverage about them, and their lives turn upside down. So he still has a lot of them very much intimidated.
Yeah.
But I will say this: I talked to a member of the Senate a couple days ago. We were having a conversation, and he said, here's a guy who's been publicly supportive, privately skeptical, as many of them are. And he said, he goes, I read what you said about Nixon, and, we stood up there as Republicans in 73 and said it's a witch hunt, it's the liberal media, and in 74, we lost 49 House seats and 8 Senate seats.
Yep.
And corruption kills, and that's another thing I've seen in my long career in politics, is that the years where you're perceived to be the corrupt party, right or wrong, in 94, the Democrats, the House bank scandal hurt them terribly. with average voters. In 2006, Abramoff and Mark Foley hurt Republicans terribly in the 2006 elections. And so that perception, if it becomes that this is the party covering for a corrupt president who is in bed with Russian government officials, I think it could lead downstream consequences that really hurt a lot of the elected folks who think they can get away with it.
We're talking to Republican strategist Rick Wilson. His new book, Everything Trump Touches Dies. Rick, let's talk character for a minute. Michael Flynn, regardless of what you may think of him and his behavior, he had this consulting company that his son was involved with, and the consulting company apparently committed crimes that involved collusion with the Russians and the Republican Party and being in the White House and all this kind of stuff. And when Robert Mueller started sniffing around his son, Michael Flynn Jr., Michael Flynn came out and said to Mueller, according to numerous press reports, if you're going to take my son down, this is where I draw the line. I will turn myself in. I will confess to whatever you want. I'll turn state's evidence. Just leave my boy alone. Donald Trump, on the other hand, says, oh, you've got some dirt on my son? Well, here's the real evidence. Put him in jail. By the way, I knew nothing about it. What does that tell us about these two men?
Well, look, I mean, Michael Flynn at least proved that for all of his terrible judgment and his flirtations with the Russians, that at least there's some tiny scrap of honor about his family left inside of him. And the best case scenario you can make for that tweet from Donald Trump is that he's just not that bright, and he thought he was going to get his son out of trouble, and he got him into it. But the darkest interpretation is that this is a guy who hates everybody, and who will do anything to preserve his own position and freedom and power, and was willing to put his son under the wheels of the bus. That's the dark interpretation, and Trump tends to lend himself to the darker interpretations as a general rule. But this was clearly something that he will regret no matter what. I mean, this is going to make for an awkward family Thanksgiving dinner.
Yeah, to say the very least. It seems to me that there's probably two major possibilities here with regard to this tweet by Trump. One is that he somehow thought that if he could just put it out there, that would mean that it wasn't, a conspiracy or a crime. It wasn't a cover-up any longer. It's out in the public domain, so it's all good now. That kind of thing, that he just was fundamentally uninformed about the law, okay? That's one possibility. The other possibility is that he doesn't give a rat's ass about the law, that he really and truly believes he's above the law, and if he can just convince enough Americans that they should side with him, that they will prevent him from being impeached, they will prevent the courts from doing their job, or even that he thinks that at some point he needs to stop the law, essentially, and just flip us into an authoritarian dictatorship. Now I think that's like one of the darkest interpretations, to use your phrase. What are your thoughts on that polarity?
Look, I think there's that Venn diagram, those three circles of that Venn diagram could all overlap.
Yeah.
He could definitely believe the wrong things about the actual statutory impact of his behavior and his confessions. He could definitely believe that he may have done something illegal and can get away with it if he just browbeats people hard enough and rants long enough. And he could definitely believe that, as a president, he is unconstrained by the law. And I think it's pretty clear that Donald Trump is, to say the least, authoritarian curious.
Yeah.
He is a man who, loves Putin, loves the strong men of the world, the Dutertes and the Kims and the Zs of the world, and he has a sense of sort of machismo and swagger that his fans may love, but that it's a sense of a different kind of American presidential leadership that leads to a very dark place when it's been tried in millions of other or hundreds of other cases around the world over time. And I think that it's a great danger to our democracy and to our republic if we start letting a president of any party get away with treating the rule of law like it's optional.
Yeah. Republican strategy. I'm sorry, you finish your sentence.
I was just saying, and I think that's one of the most dangerous things about Trump is that the law means nothing if it inconveniences me politically. That's a bad precedent.
We're talking to Republican strategist Rick Wilson. His new book, Everything Trump Touches Dies. Rick, last question. Typically, most of the listeners of my program are Democrats, I'm guessing, or progressives in general. But there are a lot of Republicans who listen, and a lot of them call in and sometimes agree, sometimes disagree. What would you say to those people who have been Republicans for 30 years like you, who are not sure what to do now?
Well, I would say this, is that there are a lot of principles in the Republican Party's tradition that we need to get back to. And some of those principles had gotten a little bit lost even before Trump, but the adherence to the rule of law, the actual adherence to the Constitution in ways that sometimes are inconvenient for parts of the Republican base, to return to a sense of real adherence to the rule of law, to get back to the sense that conservatism isn't about social engineering on the right. We object to it on the left, and we should not try to make it about that on the right. We should be a party of limited government, of personal freedom and responsibility, and of the things that have shaped our better traditions.
And not Donald Trump. Book is Everything Trump Touches Dies. Rick, thanks so much for being with us, Rick.